You are about to hear one of the greatest violinists of her generation, a performer who will dazzle, inspire, and inform you about the fascinating world of Baroque music. Please help me welcome back to Montana Baroque violinist Monica Huggett and her colleagues Susan Jensen and Lori Prestis.
Developed to play dance music. Nobody is really sure how the violin evolved. There's lots and lots of different theories, and there's one theory which I particularly like, so I think I'll expound that one to you, because I think it's a very romantic story. It's to do with Spain and its Moorish influence. It's possible that the Moors were better at making instruments earlier than we were. I mean, if you think of it, they came from the cradle of civilization. They were probably, well, they definitely were ahead of us in many subjects like mathematics. So the first representation of something that looks like a violin seems to be a gargoyle on a cathedral in northern Spain, and that cathedral was built in the late 15th century. God knows really what a violin was, but it was a wasted instrument. It had ribs, it had a peg box, and it was tuned in fifths. Of course, we can't tell whether this gargoyle violin was tuned in fifths, but it looks very like a violin. Now, the story, I think, goes that in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella threw all the Jews out of Spain. and it seems quite likely that the Jewish people were the ones who were the musicians, and they fled, and a lot of them probably went to Venice because there was a Jewish ghetto in Venice. Some of you may have visited there. You can still visit it. It's quite an extraordinary place. And the violin turned up in Italian iconography between 1495 and 1505. So people think that Spanish Jewish violinists went to live in Venice, and it was from there that it spread all the way through Italy. And another fact which supports this idea, which is an extraordinary story, is that in 1540, King Henry VIII of England, who was very, very musical and a composer, was very keen to get good musicians, and maybe had heard about this fantastical instrument, the violin. And he spoke to Catherine, or he heard from Catherine de' Medici, that the best violinists were the Jewish violinists in Venice. And he sent to Venice in 1540, and he got, I don't know how many, 6 or 8 of them to come. He had to smuggle them out of Venice, and they came to England, and they played in his court. And then in 1542, there was another pan-European pogrom, and he threw his own musicians into jail, and one of them died in jail. But it seems that he probably did this because it was politic, and he let them out in 1543, and they went back to court, and they carried on playing, and they sent to Venice and got a replacement, and they carried on running a little violin mafia from Venice to the English court for the next 100 years. And of course they lived there, and that's why you have composers like Ferrabosco, Lupo, Bassano. They were all the descendants of these original Jewish Italians who came over. So that's one story that you could say that it came from Arabian Peninsula, or came from the East. Certainly it didn't just crop up in Italy. It also, they had something like the violin in Poland, and they had the violin in France. The gypsies may have also had something to do with it, and there were plenty of gypsies in Spain as well. Somehow this instrument sort of took over and began its meteoric rise to become, in the late 18th century, the most popular and dominant instrument. But I'm going to read something because in the 16th century, if you were a lord or lady, or if you were a gentleman, you didn't play the violin. The violin was considered a coarse instrument, squeaky loud and harsh, and was only played by professionals. I'll read you, this is Jean de Fer, author of the 1556 treatise Epitome Musicale. His view on the lowly status of the violin, his views on the lowly status of the violin are apparent in the following passage. The violin is very different from the viol. First of all, it has only 4 strings, which are tuned in fifths. The form of the body, smaller, flatter in sound, is much harsher than the viol. It has no frets. Why do we call one type of instrument viols and the other violins? We call viols those with which gentlemen, merchants, and other virtuous people pass their time. I have not illustrated the said violin because you can think of it as resembling the viol, added to which there are few persons who use it, save those who make a living from it through their labour. So, we're going to play you a few more of these march tunes. These are actually from the very, very beginning of the 17th century, by which time the aristocrats in the whole of Europe had decided that the violin was a really good thing because the aristocrats just wanted to dance. That's all they seemed to do. You know, they didn't have MTV, they didn't have anything, and so they used to put together these incredible shows which were really like 16th and 17th century musicals, and they used to dance in them themselves. And so there's lots of music. That first piece was called the Essex Antic Mass, and now we're going to play 3 masks. The first one was the Goat's Mask, then the second is Sir John Packington's, and then the first of the Temple Antic. In the 16th century, once these aristocrats had decided they liked dancing to violins, in fact, this kind of music was probably performed by a consort of instruments, and they would have had 2 violins, 2 violas, and a bass. And they sort of call them violino piccolo, violino, alto viola, tenor viola, and bassetto. And this little fiddle that I have here is actually a 1618 Brothers Amati from Cremona, and I think it is what you would call a piccolo fiddle. It's very small. It's the length of the back is almost standard, but the shoulders are tiny and the ribs are tiny, and it's in pretty much original condition, especially as I've gone super authentic, and I have completely gut strings. So the G string is pure gut, and as you can see, it's as thick as a rope. Top string is gut, they're all gut. And this is a kind of authentic stringing for the early 17th century. Gimping, which is winding strings with metal, didn't really happen until after the middle of the 17th century. And this is one of the reasons why you don't have an awful lot of G-string music for the early violin, because, I mean, it does sort of, it's a sort of pitch, but it's not exactly a cutting sound. And this, of course, this is an early 17th century bow, which we affectionately call a twig. And as you can see from the shape, you can see why it's called a bow, because it's quite closely related to a bow and arrow bow. And the good thing about these little tiny bows is they can move very fast. And you'll hear in some of the other repertoire that they use that. They use the possibility to articulate very fast in a way which you cannot do with a modern bow, because a modern bow weighs twice as much. In the 16th century, the violin had not yet dominated, and the most popular instrument was an extraordinary instrument called the cornetto, which in England is an ice cream. And it's actually a wooden instrument shaped vaguely like a horn, which is what it came from. It's covered with a thin layer of leather. It has holes like a recorder, and the mouthpiece is made of bone, and you blow it like a trumpet. And it is absolutely fabulous. The first time I ever heard a cornetto, I just completely fell in love with it and the person who played it. It's like a most refined kind of tenor, alto or soprano saxophone, and it has this way of playing incredibly mellifluously. If you ever get a chance, you must hear a cornetto. And those were the favoured instruments for sophisticated music in the 16th century. And they used to play things called diminutions, which means that you would have a tune and you'd decorate it with these fantastic running up and down scales and it was all in the right key. Twice on the spot. But the violin started to take over, and the next piece I'm going to play is actually diminutions on a madrigal of Palestrina. Palestrina's madrigals, it seems, were very, very popular, and everybody knew the tunes. And it was very fashionable to improvise. This is an improvisation by Francesco Rognoni, who came from a musical family. His father is also quite famous. And These are written out diminutions, which is why I can play them. But he probably wrote them out to teach his students, and his students wrote at the back of the book that, well, yes, these ones he happened to write out, but he could improvise like this differently every single time. He didn't need the music, so you can imagine when I play them, somebody who can just do that out of the top of their head. It's quite impressive. The madrigal is Io son ferito. I need to see the music. The only trouble with gut strings is that when you come from Portland, Oregon to Montana in the winter, they go nuts. The English were quite slow to take to the violin. They were very keen on the viola da gamba, and there's a story that when they first got the violin, they tuned it in fourths and played it on their knees. They didn't know what to do. But I think there's a passage in Pete's diary where he's very excited because he's got a new violin and it's a Cremona. So Cremona was already beginning to dominate violins. Andrea Amati, it's his 500th anniversary this year, and he was the one who really fixed the form. And so the Italians were the dominant makers right from the middle of the 16th century. But once the violin had got going, it proved very popular, and I'm now going to play a division from a book called The Division Violin, which was published in London in 1684, was very popular. Divisions are they're like diminutions, only they're not quite as fast, and they're kind of variations. They're just variations on the tune. So this is a tune called Paul's Steeple or The Duke of Norfolk. and now I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Fontana was one of the violinists who played, I think, in St. Mark's, Venice, so he would have known Monteverdi. And Venice was decimated by the plague twice, 1630 and then again in 1662. And Fontana died in the 1630 plague, along with a lot of other musicians from St. Mark's. And in 1641, a lot of his friends decided that he had been so wonderful that they really should try and gather up what material was left and publish it. He was, I can't remember exactly, but you know, the best of the best of the best of the best. That's the dedication page, goes on and on. So they published this opus of 18 sonatas, and the first 6 are solo sonatas. This is number 2, which I think is one of the 2 best of the solo sonatas. You can see how rhapsodic. I should really be talking also about the history of the sonata. The word sonata comes from sonare, meaning sound. And until the 18th century, it was a very, very free thing. And you'll see by this sonata, sometimes you change tempos every 3 or 4 bars. I was asked to send a program with movements, and I said, well, you know, there's really no point, because all you'd have is a list of about 18 different tempo markings. It wouldn't make any sense. There aren't movements in the same way that you would have in a Mozart sonata. Sonatas, they're kind of whimsical in the 17th century, just float from one thing to another. A little bit of dance music, a bit of declamation, a little bit of genuine melody. It all gets mixed up together. The most famous flute player ever, I think. He was an interesting character. He went between England and Denmark. He worked at the Danish court, and it seems that they have now proved conclusively that he was a spy. It's very tempting to us. You know? We go backwards and forwards all the time. We can very easily carry bits of information. It's a very natural job for a musician. But he wrote this wonderful Lacrimae Cavern, Flow My Tears are the words of the song, and then he did an arrangement for viol consort with lots of flute diminutions. And I'm going to play a version by Johann Schopp, who has appeared, this piece has appeared on records of German, Dutch and Danish music, so nobody actually knows really which country he belongs to. He's in that area, probably somewhere around North Germany, I suppose. I guess if it's German, it's Schopp, and if it's Dutch, it's Schopp. It's published in a book called The Outnemend Cabinet, which is a Dutch book. So. is by Thomas Baltzar, very fascinating character. He was born in Lubeck, and there's a good chance that he was actually Jewish. He was Baltzar or Balthazar, so something like exotic. Lubeck was a big cultural centre, and he probably worked in the cathedral. A lot of Jewish musicians, after those terrible experiences, became so-called new Christians, and they were actually affiliated to parishes and they had Christian names, but they actually carried on practicing their religious beliefs secretly. But he left Lubeck and he went to Rome, probably because he thought he could learn some tricks from those Italians, and he met up with Queen Christina of Sweden, and he went to Sweden with her, and then he came to England where he was known as Baltzar the Swede. And he could play the violin in a way which the English had never ever seen. There was some kind of competition between George Mell, who was a famous English violinist, and Thomas Baltzar, and there was no competition. Baltzar was so much more virtuosic that the story goes that they went up and lifted up his trousers to see if he had hooves, because he must be in league with the devil. This is his division on Don't Come Kiss Me Now, and I think this is the best of all the 17th century division pieces. big violin, but I'm prepared a bit later. My big violin and my big bow. Parallels Round is another piece from the division violin, but we're pretty sure it probably was Paranelli, as London was chock-a-block with Italian violinists at that time. La Folia, very, very old tune. It's a kind of chaconne, started live as a lascivious Spanish dance. I think it was banned in lots of places. This is very similar to the Corelli Folia, which is the last piece of the Opus 5, and is also the last piece in Vivaldi's Opus 1. But this is just a little bit of a shorter version. You could say that the first half of the 17th century was the beginning of idiomatic violin writing. There's very, very little music specific where they specify violin in the 16th century. I read that the first piece of music was for a French wedding in 1581. So before that, I'm sure there were fiddlers, but they would have been people who played 100 tunes by ear, and they would have improvised the whole lot. They probably didn't need music at all. But between 1600 and 1650, there was a tremendous flowering of the violin and violin music. The next piece is by Biagio Marini, who was born in 1597, died in 1665, and he was probably the most brilliant of that first generation of Italian violinists, and had a lot of technical innovations. This piece that I'm going to play has lots of fast notes, it has double stops, and I've played other pieces. There's an extraordinary piece of his where in the middle you have 5 bars off, you tune the E string down a third, and you play thirds in scordatura, and then you have another 5 bars and you tune it up again and play normal. It's actually, I don't quite know how he did it because the strings weren't stabilised, but he was obviously a bit of a whiz, and I think very influential. After this I'm going to play a Bieber sonata, and it feels to me like the Marini techniques just hopped over the Alps to Salzburg, where Bieber was. It's very similar music, it's just expanded a bit. So this is the Sonata Quarta in due corde. and my bow to my rather late violin, a little late for this programme, but indicating which direction the violin was going. Towards the end of the 17th century, the bow got a lot longer, and that continued through the 18th century until the middle of the 18th century, when they started to produce the bows with the hatchet head and the incurve. And this is just, actually it's a slightly oversized instrument, but I suppose by the middle of the 17th century, violins had become more standardized, and they weren't making two models anymore, they were just making one size of instrument. I'm now going to play some Heinrich Ignaz Xavier von Bieber. He was born in 1644 and he died in 1704. Last year there were lots of celebrations. It was a tercentennial of the death. He was of lowly birth, but was such a phenomenal musician that the Archbishop of Salzburg allowed him to put von in front of his name, which meant he was elevated to the aristocracy. You'll hear lots of the same sort of things that you heard with Marini, but everything the technique has expanded. We don't really know exactly how they held the violin before 1700, but they probably held it in lots of different ways. They said that Balthasar held it on his short rib. Your short rib's here. So he must have had an incredibly long arm. And you see lots of frescoes where they seem to be playing like this, which I think was quite common. And Gimignani, the book of Gimignani, which is 1762, is pretty much like this. It's pretty much a modern position, but of course no chin rest, no shoulder rest. I used my little piece of leather, which my friends call my cannelloni. But again, in this music you hear a lot of what I would call gypsy influence. Those bohemians, Bieber was a bohemian, seem to still have some ideas of Russia or Afghanistan. At the beginning of this piece in E minor, I have a very romantic picture of the lone horseman on the steppe. It's quite Hollywood. Pitch. We're playing a half step below modern pitch, which is a sort of 20th century standardization of Baroque pitch. In fact, there wasn't any standardization. In the 17th century, the French preferred very, very low pitch. Their A was 392, which was a whole step on the modern pitch. And that little fiddle was probably designed to play at A440 or even A462. The Italians liked high pitch, and in Venice at that time they played very, very high pitch. The cornetos are very high pitch. And then in Rome, where Corelli was, they liked low pitch. It was at 392. So there were different pitches all over the place. They say Johann Sebastian Bach was like A410. Standardization didn't really happen until 20th century. big daddy of the modern violin. He wouldn't have anybody in his orchestra who couldn't sustain a double stop, one down bow for 10 seconds with a really good sound. So that by then the violin was beginning to develop its bel canto side, and Vivaldi was writing, in the next 20 years, just hundreds, if not thousands, of violin concertos were written. And it had won the battle. It was the top dog. And Corelli was quite a compulsive, obsessive kind of person. He worked on his compositions for years and years and years. It's quite likely that this Opus 5 was written way back in the 1680s, but he had an eye for the moment, and it's probably no accident that they were published in the year 1700, and they were very, very popular and had an incredible influence over the development of Western classical music, because in these sonatas he laid down the basis for modulating and the circle of fifths, and this was taken up by Vivaldi, and then Vivaldi was imitated by Bach, and then blah blah, sonata form. Sonata form came and ruined our lives. Oh yes, they were so very popular that there was a printing war. They were published in Amsterdam because the new engraving, much better than the horrible wood blocks. The Italians had used a block for every single note, which is hideous to read. And the Dutch came up with engraving on copper plates, and it was just the best thing since sliced bread. And the new middle class started to buy the music they wanted to play in their own homes. And Mr. Walsh in London also published the Corelli sonatas. And in order to get the edge on the sales, he published a set saying that they were with the ornaments of Monsieur Corelli himself. The slow movements, because that was a big thing at that time, was that in the slow movements you added lots of extra notes. And these are probably not by Corelli, but they're probably by an Italian violinist who was in London, and they do indicate something about the style of ornamentation at that time. So I'm going to play this Opus 5 number 1 with those Walsh ornaments. Thank you.